Here is something Microsoft never expected anyone to say out loud. 1 million people downloaded a free operating system in a matter of weeks, and nearly 800,000 of them came directly from Windows, not from tech enthusiasts, not from programmers or engineers or Linux hobbyists, regular people, office workers, students, grandparents, teachers. And here is the part that should terrify Microsoft. They are not coming back. Now, you might be thinking, okay, 1 million downloads, and so what? Tech people switch systems all the time. But that is exactly the point. These are not tech people. These are the people who, for the past 30 years, never once questioned whether Windows was the only option, and something happened that pushed them past a line they never thought they would cross. So, in this video, we are going to break down exactly what that something was, why it worked the way it did, and what it means for every single person watching this who still has Windows installed on their computer right now, because by the end of this, you might be asking yourself a question you have never seriously asked before. And that question is going to change the way you think about who actually owns your computer. Stay with me. Let's be honest about something that the tech world rarely admits. Nobody ever loved Windows. There was no Windows fan club. Nobody had a Windows poster on their bedroom wall. Nobody cried when a new version launched because they were so emotionally connected to the brand. Windows was not Apple. Windows was not something people felt passionate about, but it had something that, in the long run, is more powerful than love. It had trust, and not the kind of trust that comes from a great experience. The kind of trust that comes from consistency, from predictability, from showing up the same way every single time for decades. You bought a computer. You turned it on. Windows was there. It ran your printer. It opened your spreadsheets. It played your videos. It worked with the software your job used, the games your kids played, the tools your accountant emailed you as attachments. Every piece of hardware ever made worked with Windows. Every piece of software ever written ran on Windows. That is not love. That is dependency. And dependency, when it runs deep enough, becomes something that feels almost like loyalty. Until the day it doesn't. Microsoft did not build 30 years of dominance through passion. They built it through an invisible contract. The contract said, "We will always be here. We will always work, and we will not get in your way." For 3 decades, they kept that contract. And then, one day they decided to rewrite it, without asking anyone to sign it. Here is where things start getting interesting, and honestly, a little infuriating. Windows 11 arrived, and the first thing it did was look at hundreds of millions of perfectly working computers and say, "You do not qualify. TPM 2.0 chips, specific processor generations, hardware requirements that had nothing to do with whether your computer could actually run the software, and everything to do with Microsoft's internal roadmap and business decisions." Machines that had been running Windows 10 smoothly, quickly, and reliably for years were suddenly labeled unsupported, officially outdated, officially finished. Let that sink in for a second. Your computer still worked. Your computer was still fast. Your computer was still doing everything you needed it to do, but Microsoft looked at it and said, "Not good enough. Time to buy something new," and then they set a deadline. October 2025, end of support for Windows 10, no more security patches, no more updates, no more protection against the hackers and viruses and attacks that are always looking for a way in. Regular users were handed a choice with no good options. Option 1, buy new hardware to meet Windows 11's requirements, which, by the way, many people simply cannot afford. Option 2, pay for extended security support. Yes, pay extra to keep your existing computer safe. Option 3, upgrade to a Windows 11 that looked different, felt different, and behaved in ways that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Option 4, stay on an unsupported system and hope for the best. For the first time in 30 years, Windows was not offering an upgrade. It was issuing an ultimatum. And here is why that matters psychologically, because this is where the real story starts. People accept change. They do it all the time. What they do not accept, what triggers a completely different emotional response, is being forced. Microsoft did not invite their users into the future. They handed them a deadline and told them to figure it out. That is a completely different experience, and the reaction it created was something Microsoft's leadership clearly did not anticipate. Now here is the thing. The deadline alone might not have been enough to push people over the edge if everything else had been fine. But everything else had not been fine. Not for years. The frustrations had been building slowly, quietly, in ways that each felt too small to justify switching systems, but together formed something that millions of people felt every single day without being able to fully name it. Ads. Inside the Start menu. Not on a website, not in an app, but inside the operating system itself. Inside the tool you use to find your own files on your own computer. Ads in File Explorer. A notification system that pushed Microsoft products and services at you constantly. Background processes you never installed, never approved, running constantly and eating your RAM and your CPU without your permission. Telemetry? That is the word Microsoft uses for data collection, sending information about how you use your computer back to Microsoft servers automatically, by default, whether you wanted it to or not. Forced Microsoft account requirements. Want to set up Windows 11 fresh? You need a Microsoft account, not an optional suggestion, a requirement on your own machine. Settings that you carefully changed being quietly reset after updates, as if Microsoft decided they knew better than you about how your own computer should behave. And then came Copilot. AI assistant pushed into the interface whether you wanted it or not, and when users pushed back loudly enough that Microsoft announced that they were removing it, the company's response was not to remove it. It was to remove the word Copilot. Just the label. The feature stayed. The audacity of that move became a punchline, but it also told users everything they needed to know about where they stood in the relationship, and then there was recall, a feature that Microsoft planned to ship that would take regular screenshots of everything you did on your computer and store it so an AI could analyze your activity history. The feature was eventually delayed under enormous public pressure, but the fact that it was designed, built, and almost shipped without asking users whether they wanted their entire behavioral history recorded crystallized everything. The pattern became undeniable. Windows was no longer your operating system. It was Microsoft's platform, running on your hardware, collecting your behavior, monetizing your attention, on their schedule, under their rules. And that realization, once people had it, changed everything. So here is the open question that this whole story sets up. If people were finally ready to leave Windows, and millions clearly were, where exactly were they supposed to go? Because this is where Linux has always been the obvious theoretical answer that always failed in practice. Linux has been technically superior to Windows in many ways for years. Faster, lighter, more secure, free, open source, no corporate agenda, no ads, no telemetry feeding an advertising machine. But Linux had one problem that all of its technical advantages could never fix. It was terrifying to use if you had never used it before. Terminals, command lines, package managers, file system structures that looked nothing like anything a Windows user had ever seen. Installation processes that assumed you already knew what you were doing. Error messages that sent you down rabbit holes of documentation written by engineers for other engineers. Linux was a great tool for a very specific kind of person. That person was not a retired teacher with a 5-year-old laptop. That person was not a college student who just needed to write papers and stream videos. That person was not the average Windows user who was fed up but had never, in 30 years, thought seriously about an alternative. And then Zorin OS decided to solve exactly that problem. Zorin's team made a decision that sounds obvious in hindsight, but that no major Linux distribution had ever fully committed to before. Instead of building for Linux enthusiasts, they built for Windows refugees. The taskbar sits at the bottom of the screen, exactly where Windows users expect it. The Start menu opens from the left, exactly where Windows users reach for it. The File Manager looks familiar. The Settings panel uses language that makes sense to someone who has never touched Linux in their life. Applications come pre-installed. The installation process walks you through every step. Zorin did not try to convert Windows users to a Linux philosophy. They met Windows users exactly where those users were standing and built a bridge from that exact spot. That sounds like a small design choice. It was not. It was everything. Let's get into the specifics, because the details here are genuinely impressive and explain why Zorin specifically caught fire when the Windows 10 deadline arrived. The first thing that trips up almost every Windows user trying Linux for the first time is software compatibility. They drag a .exe file, a Windows program, onto their new Linux system, and the system either does nothing or throws a confusing error that sends them running back to Windows. Zorin solved this in a way that is almost elegant in its simplicity. When you drag a windows.exe file onto Zorin, the system detects the file type and actively suggests native Linux alternatives, compatible replacement applications from a database of hundreds of options. Instead of a confusing failure, you get a helpful suggestion. Instead of a wall, you get a door. That single feature eliminates what was historically the most demoralizing moment in the entire experience of switching to Linux. The moment something does not work, and you have no idea what to do next. Then there is Zorin Lite, which deserves its own moment of attention because it directly addresses Microsoft's most controversial decision. Remember all those computers that Windows 11 declared obsolete? The ones that were still working perfectly but did not meet the hardware requirements? Those computers did not actually stop working. They just stopped being supported. Zorin Lite, built on an ultra-lightweight desktop environment called XFCE, runs beautifully on exactly that hardware. Users who installed Zorin Lite on their unsupported machines reported their boot times dropping dramatically, their applications opening faster, their entire system feeling more responsive than it ever did on Windows 10. And here is the real story behind that. The computer was never the problem. The operating system consuming its resources with background telemetry, cloud sync processes, and constant update services was the problem. Remove that weight, and the hardware breathes again. It turns out the laptop you were told was too old is not too old at all. It was just being used as a server for someone else's data collection. Now, this is the part where I want to tell you something about what is coming next in the story. Because what happened after this, the way this spread through communities that had nothing to do with tech, is actually the most fascinating part. And we are going to get to that in just a moment. But first, think about what you have just heard. Because there is a word I have been building toward for the last few minutes, and that word is privacy. And the privacy angle of this story is where things stop being about features and start being about something much more fundamental. Here's the part nobody talks about clearly enough. Microsoft's business model is not a secret. Advertising, cloud services, data collection. By default, Windows tracks what you open, what you search, how long you spend on every task, and feeds that into systems that make Microsoft money. You never explicitly agreed to it. It was buried in settings nobody changes and terms nobody reads. Zorin operates on a completely different model. No ads, no forced accounts, no background data collection. Updates happen when you decide. The operating system does not have its own agenda. For users who had spent years watching Windows quietly take more control with every update, the experience of using Zorin felt like one thing above everything else, their computer working for them again. That feeling is what turned a migration story into a movement. Here is what the tech industry consistently underestimates. One real person showing another real person something that genuinely works. A retired teacher tells her book club her old laptop, the one Windows 11 rejected, now runs better than ever. No ads. Easy setup. She shows them the screen. It looks normal. No marketing budget replicates that. A college student shows 3 roommates their slow-budget laptop is now fast. Those 3 roommates remember that moment 6 months later when they hit their own Windows frustration. The Zorin forums filled with posts from complete beginners who installed it on a Sunday afternoon, and by Monday were doing everything they used to do on Windows without confusion. That destroyed the most persistent myth about Linux, that it is only for technical people. When a non-technical person uses it casually in front of another non-technical person, that myth evaporates. And it does not come back. If you are finding this valuable, a subscription helps us keep going deep on stories like this one. Now, Microsoft's response to all of this is something we need to address directly. More AI, more cloud integration, more Copilot, more subscriptions. Microsoft is reading this as a product problem, a gap in features that better engineering can close. It is not a product problem. Users are not leaving because Windows lacks features. They are leaving because Windows stopped feeling like their property. That is a trust problem. And fixing a trust problem requires dismantling the very things making Microsoft money: the ads, the telemetry, the ecosystem lock-in. Remove those and you remove revenue. There is no version of that conversation Wall Street accepts. So Microsoft is stuck in a trap of their own making. Adding better features to a platform people feel trapped in does not solve the trap. It just makes the walls more interesting. The people who found the door are already outside. Let's see the full picture. What is happening here is not just one operating system gaining users from another. It is a recalibration of something the tech industry took for granted for 30 years, that users will accept whatever the platform gives them because they have no real choice. Microsoft raised the cost of staying through hardware requirements, deadlines, constant monetization, and the growing feeling of being monitored. Zorin lowered the cost of leaving to nearly zero. When the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving, people leave. That is not a Linux story. That is how trust works in any relationship. The users who switched are not going back. Not because they are ideologically committed to open source, but because they found something that works, that does not treat them as a product, and that gives them back the feeling that their computer belongs to them. That feeling, once rediscovered, is very hard to give up. Linux has been technically ready for years. The question was always whether the experience would become accessible enough for people who were not already looking for an alternative. Zorin answered that question with 1 million downloads. Imperfect freedom feels better than polished captivity, and no amount of new features changes that. Drop a comment below. Still on Windows, thinking about switching, or already on the other side? The conversation here is always worth reading, and there is one more layer to this story we have not touched yet, involving hardware manufacturers, AI chips, and a shift in who physically controls what your computer can do. That is the next video. You will want to be there.